Woodworkers, I'm here to solve a problem. The biggest issue as a beginner woodworker is getting the right materials and working with the right machines. And for that, you need a huge shop and you need to spend a lot of money. The question is, how do you use recycled wood and still make a project that is precise?
I took apart a pallet and I plan to use this piece of wood. It jiggles because it is bent in a weird way, and this makes it impossible to use for anything that could be called precise. Not only is it curved in this direction, but it is also warped along its width. This means that any project I use it for will be impossible to level.
And how do you correct these mistakes? Usually, they would use a jointer or a drum sander to sand off the surface finish and to use the recycled pallet wood. But since I do not have the space for these machines, nor the money to buy these machines, I'm left with no option, unless I get creative.
So that's exactly what I plan to do. You know, plywood is surprisingly straight. And that's why I plan to use this to make a jig that will be able to level a plane of a piece of wood. For this project, only basic hand tools will be required. So, you can see me using a circular saw, but this seriously is not required. Really, the only thing that you cannot exchange for something else is a router, a plunge router to be exact. I'm making a jig for a plunge router that is going to be able to take off a tiny piece of the surface of a curved piece of wood, and hopefully this will fix its curved surface. I've sketched out the bottom of my router onto this piece of plywood. You can see 4 holes and a center hole where the router bit will go. But it is not in the center of the piece, because I want to have about 5 centimeters of offset from the center. This means that I will be able to cut a larger piece of wood in my small jig. Basically, you cut one side, then you flip the board around, and then you cut the other side. So it's simple. These 4 holes on the sides that I'm drilling out right now will attach to the router's base with some machine screws. I'm going to countersink these side holes because I want them to sit flush with the plane of the plywood. The center hole is going to be made with a hole saw, but again, you can replace this with a jigsaw and you don't have to be precise or exact. Only these 4 connection holes are supposed to be precise. I only have this small drill, so it's going to take a while to get through this whole piece of wood. But I make sure to go from both sides so that I don't have any tear out at the other end. As a beginner woodworker, it is really hard to get started because you don't have the tools necessary to be precise. For example, a drill press would have made this way easier. But you gotta make do with what you have. And this whole project is built on the idea that you can make any product with basic tools if only you invest time in planning and execution. This is my cheapo router, and there are 4 screws mounting this base plate onto the bottom of the router, which I'm gonna take off and replace with my plywood contraption. Plywood is great because even if you apply a bit more pressure, it will not sag and produce a precise and level surface. This is going to be an extended reference surface for the bottom of my router. And after this, all I need is 2 strips of something flat that I can rest this router base upon, and this will create my jig. Thankfully, I managed to get the holes quite right, and this will fit on the bottom of my router. So I just attach these machine screws to the bottom of the router and it's done. The final dimension is pretty large, so the maximum size that I can do is about 50 centimeters in width. And I think that is really cool, because that is almost at the size where you can make a table with the piece of wood that you mill flat. I have these 2 aluminum extrusions which are really flat, and I'm going to be fixing my plank between them. But they are a bit too high, so I raised the plank up with some pieces of drywall. And I know this is not optimal, but this is gonna have to do for now. I fixed it in with some screws, and now comes the moment of truth.
Okay, setup is done. Now let's get this precise. And just as a side note, please be careful and be safe. Give the respect that the machine deserves. And remember, when you're walking to the pub and you want to order 5 beers, you don't want to do it like this.
Here you can see a side view of the whole project. I'm going to be using this to set the depth of the router. I don't want to take off too much material because then my router bit would mar into the wood a bit too much. So I'm trying to find where the lowest point of the wood piece is. Because it is curved, I will have a high point and a low point. I'm trying to find the lowest point and then setting my router bit slightly lower than that. After setting the depth, cutting can begin. I'm just moving it ever so slowly across this piece of wood and milling the surface flat with the router bit. I haven't discovered it yet, but I'm making a mistake. You don't want to go across the grain. You need to go along the grain, because then you won't be left with tear out in the wood. At this point, this is just the first pass, so it's pretty much an experiment at this point. But as you can see, I managed to end up with something a bit flat, but I've gotten a lot of tear out. Tear out is not that big of an issue. It may look a bit nasty now, but I can sand it away in a matter of minutes. And the depth deviation of the tear outs is like 0.2 millimeters, so it's really not that big of a deal. But still, it doesn't look that nice yet. After going through one side, I managed to get something that is pretty flat on one side. Obviously, the ends I couldn't do because my screws weren't countersunk, and this means that I cannot cut into those pieces. Here you can see these fuzzy pieces of tear out, but still, the whole structure of the wood is now flat. And my workshop is covered in sawdust. That's one side done. So I'm going to flip it around and route the other side and then check if I was precise enough. I cannot check it yet because the other side is still warped. So I'm going to do the other side and then sand it down to make it a bit prettier. This is really just a couple minutes of sanding, so it's no biggie. After this, I can check if I was precise enough and if the two planes of the wood are parallel to each other. I have this really straight piece of metal that I can use to check the flatness of the wood. I'm looking out for the spots where light is shining through. This means that there is some deviation between the pieces of the surface. And as you can see, along the length of the grain, there really isn't any deviation, and it's pretty precise. But, can you see that? This means that the center of the wood is higher than the two edges. Why is that? But still, I'm optimistic, since the deviation could be really small. It's really hard to measure it like this. So I'm going to need to use some better measurement techniques. But I'm optimistic because the planes of the wood are pretty parallel to each other and the whole surface is flat as can be. So I'm happy with the project. But now it's time to clean it up and to check where it could be improved.
This took about a half hour's worth of work, and I don't want to brag, but I think that it turned out great. The ends are pretty messed up, so I'm gonna cut them off. But to seriously test myself, I'm going to cut this piece in half and check the internal cross-section of the whole piece of wood.
Aha, and so the plot emerges. I've gotten this Japanese saw as a Christmas present, and I really want to start Japanese joinery, but I cannot do anything unless I have flat pieces of wood and they are precise from the get-go. I could spend my money trying to buy these pieces of wood, but it would cost a lot of money. So, this is my solution. Keep in mind, this is the first time I'm using a Japanese blade, and I really don't know what I'm doing. So this is pretty amateur work, but I want to improve and I want to test my skills and knowledge. I'm basically just cutting off the two ends, making sure to apply as little pressure as possible, because that's what I heard you do with Japanese blades. I got through this piece of wood surprisingly quickly, and it left a beautiful cut line. Here you can see that even pallet wood can be made beautiful. I think it turned out looking great. After this comes the plunge into the deep end. I want to sacrifice this piece to check that I made everything to measurement and precisely. And here is the cross section. I think that you can see it looks great. It's square, the two planes are parallel to each other, and it looks great. But my eyes can cheat a bit, so I'm gonna use some calipers and measure the thickest point and the thinnest point. And unfortunately, I have about a millimeter difference between the edges and the middle of the wood.
Okay, first try results, pretty good. I think that this piece of wood is better than if I had just used the natural pallet wood. But I want something a bit better, and I want something a bit more precise. So I'm gonna choose a larger piece of lumber and try this thing again.
So, out with the old and in with the new. I'm not quite sure what type of wood this is, but I think that it is a bit harder than just the normal pine that this plank was made out of. So, this is going to be a bit more challenging, but hopefully I can stop the sag in the middle by pre-drilling the holes for the screws and also countersinking them. I've also added some shims on the bottom to counteract the extreme amount of warpage that this plank has. I think that the previous plank had this deviation between the middle and the outer parts of the wood because of the screws. I tightened them down a bit too hard, and this made the wood sag on both sides. So this time I made sure to drill the screws in only a tiny bit so that they held the wood piece in place, but they didn't warp it further. Alright, that's one side done, and it's already looking a bit more promising than the previous one. So I'm gonna trim off these excess bits and then move on to the other side. And there you go, all done. Now let's check the flatness. Boom, that looks great. I think that it turned out way better than the previous one. There are still some slight deviations, that's why you can see some light coming through, but they are between my tolerances, which is like 0.2 or 0.3 millimeters. Here you can see the point where I realized my mistake between the crosscut and the along the grain cut. The crosscut leaves a rougher finish.
Okay, results are in, and I think that it turned out way better. There are still some issues at one end, but I managed to learn that if you go across the grain, then these small issues can arise. And if you go along the grain with your router, then all the problems will be solved. And I managed to get it down to about 0.3 or 0.4 millimeters of deviance throughout the whole width of the plank. I think that is very respectable, and I can start working with these pieces of wood.
Let me show you a before and after picture on these pieces of wood. They come from the same tree and from the same plank, but they fell apart because of rot. But as you can see, if you just take off the top surface, you can use these planks. So this means that now I have a reliable source of recycling wood and doing whatever I want with my future projects. Check out my next video if you want to see what I'm going to use this lumber for. I already hinted at Japanese joinery and I really want to try it. So please subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have just reached 50 subscribers and it feels pretty good. So thanks and bye bye. See you next time.